A few years ago, something really strange happened to me. It was summer, and my family and I had just come back from a week-long beach vacation. Everything was perfect while we were away. Sunny days, sandy beaches, and a lot of fun. But the first night back home, things started getting weird. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by our doorbell ringing. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor needing help, so I got up and went downstairs to check. But when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. I opened the door and stepped outside, but the street was empty, completely silent. I figured whoever it was must have left before I got there, so I went back to bed, a little confused, but not too worried. The next night I was woken up again, but this time it wasn't the doorbell. It was knocking on our back door. It was around midnight, and this time I felt a chill. It was strange that someone would come to our back door in the middle of the night. I went to check, but once again no one was there. The same eerie silence greeted me. I went back to bed, but it was hard to fall asleep after that. The following day, I noticed my neighbor, Mr. Ross, installing a security camera on his porch. I went over to talk to him, thinking maybe he'd had a similar experience. When I told him about the doorbell and the knocking, he told me something that sent shivers down my spine. While we were away on vacation, there had been a terrible car accident right in front of our house. A woman had died in the crash. Mr. Ross was the first one on the scene, and he saw the woman get out of her car, injured and stumbling. But before he could reach her, she collapsed. The paramedics later said it was strange she even managed to get out of the car, given how severe her injuries were. After the accident, several neighbors, including Mr. Ross, started experiencing strange things. Doorbells ringing in the middle of the night, knocks on doors, but when they checked, no one was ever there. That's why Mr. Ross installed the camera, hoping to catch whoever was doing it. That night, the knocking came again, this time on my front door. I was too scared to get up, so I just lay in bed, listening to the sound, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next morning, I went back to Mr. Ross, and we reviewed his camera footage. The camera had recorded his doorbell ringing around 3 a.m., but no one was there. We watched the entire night's footage, but not a single person appeared on the screen. Other neighbors put up cameras too, and they all reported the same thing. Doorbells ringing, knocks on doors, but no one ever seen. This continued for about 2 weeks, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No one knows what caused it, and we never found any explanation. My friend Jacob invited me, Jake and Craig, for a sleepover at his house. His parents had been out all day and had called to say they would be out for the night as well. We were all learning to play the guitar, so we spent the evening in Jacob's room, practicing and jamming together. At some point, Jacob asked me to go to the kitchen to grab some sodas for us. I headed downstairs and turned on the kitchen light. To my surprise, Jacob's grandpa was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, working on a crossword puzzle. It was odd since Jacob had mentioned we were alone for the night. I greeted his grandpa and grabbed the sodas. Feeling a bit awkward, I asked if he wanted me to leave the light on, but he didn't reply. He just took a heavy breath that seemed to imply I was bothering him. I left the light on and went back to Jacob's room. I told Jacob that his grandpa was in the kitchen, which confused him. He insisted that his grandpa hadn't been there all day, and that we were indeed alone. Alarmed, Jacob rushed downstairs, but the kitchen light was off again, and his grandpa was nowhere to be found. He thought I was playing a prank on him, so we brushed it off and kept playing guitar. About 30 minutes later, we decided to go downstairs to watch TV in the living room. We were engrossed in a show when suddenly Jacob's grandpa walked out of the kitchen and through the living room. Jacob, visibly scared, asked him what he was doing there and how he had gotten in. His grandpa didn't even look at us. He seemed lost in his own world. He simply told us not to worry about him, said goodbye, and left through the front door. We were all stunned and confused, especially Jacob, who had no idea what was happening. An hour later, Jacob's parents unexpectedly returned home. His mother entered the living room, tears streaming down her face. Jacob asked her what was wrong. and his father came in and broke the news that they had spent the entire day at the hospital with his grandpa, who had passed away a few hours ago. They hadn't told Jacob earlier because they didn't want to worry him. The room fell silent. Jacob's face looked paralyzed with shock. He managed to tell his parents that we had just seen his grandpa. We recounted our encounter, and his parents were as terrified as we were. They couldn't believe it, insisting that he had been at the hospital all day. We thought about going home to give Jacob and his family some space, but Jacob asked us to stay. The company would comfort him, he said. That night was filled with a sense of disbelief and fear that none of us could shake. Jacob never mentioned the incident again, almost as if the shock of his grandpa's death had erased it from his memory. We're still friends to this day, and I often think back to that night. The encounter left me feeling more scared than I've ever been in my life. It's a mystery we never solved, a moment that remains etched in our memories, reminding us of the unexplainable events that sometimes occur when we least expect them.
Almost every night, I stay up late playing video games in the living room of my apartment. It's a ritual for me to check the door before heading to bed, making sure it's locked. On one particular night, as I stood by the door, I felt an inexplicable urge to peek through the peephole. The hallway was usually quiet and empty, but this time, something caught my eye. The door handle of the apartment directly opposite mine was moving. It was subtle at first, a slow and deliberate turn, as if someone inside was trying to open it quietly. The handle would move, then stop for a minute, and then resume its eerie dance. I stood there, frozen, thousands of thoughts racing through my mind. Was someone trapped inside? Was my neighbor hiding a dark secret? I tried to decipher the movement, wondering if it was a desperate attempt to communicate through Morse code. The idea seemed absurd, yet I couldn't shake off the sense of dread that enveloped me. After about 10 minutes, the handle stopped moving. Shaken, I went to bed, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I watched the door handle throughout the day, but nothing happened. As night fell, the handle began its slow, haunting movement once more. I decided to contact the building's reception, explaining the bizarre occurrence. The security team checked the footage, and they also couldn't believe what they saw. They reached out to the apartment's owner, asking if he was a sleepwalker or if his children might be playing tricks. But the owner's response chilled us to the bone. The apartment was vacant. He was in the process of selling it, and no one had lived there for months. The owner even came to the building, opening the apartment to show the security team, and it was really empty, no signs of life. For a while, the mysterious movements continued nightly, then suddenly stopped. The building returned to its usual quiet, and eventually, new tenants moved into the once vacant apartment. The eerie occurrences ceased, leaving behind an unsettling mystery.
I live in a mountain area where the roads are tight, so everyone has to drive slowly to avoid accidents. My job is about 30 minutes from my house, and every night I take the same route home. One night, around 9 p.m., I was driving as usual. There was a car behind me, and occasionally other cars passed by in the opposite direction, all moving slowly due to the narrow roads. But that night, something strange happened. I blacked out for a moment. I can't remember what led to it, and I wasn't sleepy at all. Suddenly, I snapped back to consciousness and realized I had fallen asleep. My car was stopped in the middle of the road. When I looked up, I saw a car in the opposite lane also stopped, with the driver looking just as confused as I felt, as if he had just woken up too. I checked my rearview mirror and noticed that the car behind me was also stopped, with the driver looking equally confused. It was like we all fell asleep at the same time, and our cars somehow came to a stop without colliding. We exchanged glances, still trying to process what had just happened, and then we all slowly started driving again, as if nothing unusual had occurred. A little further down the road, the car behind me started flashing its headlights. I pulled over, and the driver pulled up next to me. He asked if what he thought happened had really happened. He noticed that I had fallen asleep, and the other driver seemed to be in the same dazed state as him. I told him I had no idea what had happened, and that I was just as confused as he was. We talked for a few minutes, both of us unable to explain the bizarre event. We wished each other well and went our separate ways. To this day, I can't explain what caused all of us to fall asleep so suddenly in the middle of the road. It's a mystery that still haunts me whenever I drive that route at night. I had driven out to visit an old friend who lived in a remote area, hoping for a peaceful weekend away from the city's chaos. The visit had been pleasant, but I ended up leaving much later than I had planned. By the time I hit the road, it was already night. Suddenly, out of nowhere, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, blindingly bright through the fog. The car behind me began flashing its lights and honking. My heart jumped, and I wondered if I had somehow caused an accident without realizing it. I decided to pull over to see what was wrong. I stopped my car on the side of the road, and the other vehicle pulled up in front of me, blocking my way forward. A tall guy emerged from the car, and through the fog, I could sense something was off. Knocking on my window, he leaned in close and said that something had escaped from my car and hit his windshield, and he asked me to come and see it. My heart pounded, and every instinct told me to stay in the car, so I replied that I wasn't getting out, trying to keep my voice steady. At that moment, his eyes darkened. He reached for my door handle, and I felt a surge of panic. I was glad the door was locked. He jiggled the handle more forcefully, insisting, "Come on, just take a look." But his tone was now edged with frustration and anger. My pulse was racing, and I knew I had to act fast. I started the car, praying it would start quickly. The engine roared to life, and he banged on my window, his face contorted with rage. I reversed sharply and managed to maneuver around his car. I sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror to see him standing in the middle of the road, watching me. My heart didn't stop racing until I was safely home, and even then, the eerie encounter replayed in my mind over and over. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly dangerous. The creepy feeling he gave me haunted my dreams for weeks. One evening, I invited my friend Ben over to my house for a sleepover. Around 9 p.m., we decided to take my dog, Max, for his last big walk of the day. We lived close to the woods, so it was a routine for me to walk around the familiar paths. Ben and I chatted as we walked, but then we heard some strange noises coming from deeper within the woods. My first thought was a bear, but there had never been any reports of bears in our area. The noises were odd and unsettling, making me feel uneasy. Max, who was usually calm, started barking wildly, something I'd never seen him do before. His distress grew, and he began to pull hard on his leash, trying to rush into the woods. Despite my efforts to hold on to him, the leash slipped from my hands. Max darted into the darkness, barking furiously. Panic set in as the eerie sounds from the woods grew louder. Ben and I were too scared to follow Max, especially with the unsettling noises, so we ran back home as fast as we could. I burst through the door and went straight to my father, explaining what had happened. He looked alarmed and immediately grabbed a flashlight, telling us to stay home while he went to search for Max. My father was gone for about an hour. When he returned, he was alone and had a grim look on his face. He said he couldn't find Max and mentioned that the woods were eerily silent. We were all devastated. Max was a smart dog, so we hoped he would find his way back home. My father assured us that we would search again at first light. The next morning, Ben and I woke up early and headed into the woods with my father, calling out for Max and looking everywhere. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any sign of him. Days passed, and our hopes began to wane. Then, 4 days later, as I was leaving for school in the morning, I saw a familiar shape lying on our front porch. It was Max. He was back, but he was in terrible condition. He had deep wounds and was covered in blood. We barely recognized him. I was overjoyed to see him alive, but heartbroken at his condition. We rushed him to the vet, who treated his wounds. Max survived, but he was never the same. Since that night, he was always on edge, barking at any noise coming from outside. He seemed perpetually distressed and alert. We never figured out what Max encountered in the woods that night. Whatever it was left a lasting impact on him. We speculated endlessly about what could have happened, but the truth remained a mystery. The experience left a mark on all of us, a reminder of the unknown dangers that sometimes lurk just beyond the familiar paths we tread. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. The second bedroom is reserved for guests, like my parents and younger brother who visit often, so I rarely use it. Because of this, I always keep the door closed. However, there was one strange week when I kept finding the door slightly ajar. At first, I didn't think much of it, just closed the door and moved on. But as the week went on, I noticed that this was happening constantly. Every time I walked past the room, the door would be slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. I checked the handle, thinking maybe it was faulty, but everything seemed to be in working order. Despite this, the door kept opening, even when I was in the apartment. I never heard it creak open, or any noises that might suggest something was off. It would just be open when I noticed it. Determined to figure out what was going on, I decided to test things. One morning before leaving for work, I made sure the window in the room was closed, so there was no chance of wind causing the door to move. I closed the door firmly and placed a chair against the handle, wedging it tightly so the door couldn't be easily opened. I even pushed against it to make sure the chair was holding it securely. Satisfied that the door wouldn't budge, I left for work. But when I returned at the end of the day, I found the door wide open, and the chair that I had used to secure it was lying on the floor. This time, the situation made me feel so uneasy that I couldn't stay in the apartment. I quickly packed a bag and went to a friend's house where I stayed for 2 days. After those 2 days, I felt a bit more at ease and returned to my apartment. When I got back, the door was open again, just like before. But this time, after I closed it, the door stayed shut. It never opened on its own again. It's been a while since this happened, and I still live in the same apartment. The door hasn't moved on its own since, but the memory of that strange week still lingers. I've never found an explanation for what happened, but I'm relieved that whatever it was, it seems to be over. Back when I was 15, my best friend Anna invited me and our other friend Lois for a sleepover. We spent the evening talking about the boys from school, watching TV, and eventually decided to order a pizza. When the pizza arrived, Anna opened the door. As the delivery guy handed over the pizza, I couldn't shake the weird feeling he gave me. After Anna paid, he asked her if we girls were alone at home tonight. It was such a creepy question. Anna tried to lie, saying, "No, my mom is upstairs," but she didn't sound very convincing. The guy left, but we were all feeling uneasy about the encounter. We ate the pizza and continued watching TV, but about 2 hours later, there was a knock on the door. Anna didn't want to open it, so we stayed quiet, pretending we didn't hear. The person kept knocking. After a while, he claimed to be with the police, saying they had received reports of loud music coming from our house. Anna, hesitating, managed to say, "You must be at the wrong house. I'm not hearing any music here." The guy insisted, repeatedly stating our house number. I told Anna not to open the door and to hold on. Just then, we heard someone trying to open the back door. That's when we knew this wasn't the police. Anna grabbed our hands and led us to the closet in her room. From there, she called the real police. We had no idea if the intruders had managed to get inside the house yet. Minutes later, we heard shouting from the street. It seemed like the police had arrived and spotted the guy at our front door. From what we could hear, the guy must have tried to run, but the police caught him. But we still heard noises from the back of the house. There was another person out there. Anna showed incredible bravery. She left the closet, ran to her window, and screamed to the police that there was someone else at the back door. The officers immediately ran around the house to check, but the second person must have fled. We let the police inside to search the house, relieved to find that no one else was there. The next day, the officers returned to tell us that they had searched the neighborhood and found the second man. Both men were arrested, and the police assured us that they wouldn't be bothering us anymore. The fear and adrenaline from that night stayed with us for a long time. It was terrifying to think about what might have happened if Anna hadn't been quick-thinking and brave. Even though it was a close call, we were grateful that we had made it through safely. The experience brought us closer together, but it also made us more cautious. Sleepovers weren't quite the same after that, and we never forgot the lesson we learned that night. Trust your instincts, and always stay alert. I work in a hospital, mainly in the management sector. dealing with office tasks and equipment. One early morning, it was just me and a colleague working. Both of us were focused on our computers. Suddenly, we heard a knock coming from the door near us. It was the door to a small room where we kept office equipment and printers. No one ever worked inside that room, and if someone needed to use it, they usually left the door open. The knock was distinct and sounded like a proper human knock, not like something had fallen. My colleague immediately looked up, her eyes wide, staring at me and then at the door. I even asked her if she had heard it too, and she confirmed she did. Feeling uneasy but curious, I decided to check it out. I approached the door, opened it, and found the room completely empty. It was silent as usual, with no sign of anyone having been there. The whole situation was so strange that we laughed it off and went back to work. About 30 minutes later, we both heard the printer in that same room start up, as if someone was printing something. My colleague looked at me again, her eyes wide with disbelief. I went to check on the printer, and to my surprise, it was spitting out blank sheets of paper. It wasn't printing anything. The papers were just coming out blank. I unplugged the printer, plugged it back in, and spent the rest of the day on edge, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But nothing did. The printer worked normally after that, and we never experienced anything creepy like that again. One weekend, I went to my friend Mike's uncle's farm for a getaway. We were excited about riding horses and spending time by the river that ran behind the farm. Mike's uncle worked late, so we often found ourselves alone until about 2 a.m. One night, we were asleep when a loud blast echoed through the house, coming from the direction of the living room. Strange sounds followed. Startled and scared, Mike and I jumped out of bed and rushed to see what was happening. To our surprise, we found a cow standing in the living room, having broken through the door. The cow was distressed, making terrifying sounds, and we were utterly confused. After a few minutes, the cow suddenly collapsed on the floor. We didn't know if it had died or just passed out. Upon closer inspection, we noticed some spikes on its back, resembling tranquilizer darts. Our confusion turned to concern as we heard more noises coming from the barn. It sounded like more cows were in distress. We started running towards the barn, but halfway there we heard giggles. It became clear that someone was trying to mess with the farm. Mike asked me to wait while he ran back to grab his uncle's rifle. Armed, we headed to the barn, where we found more cows lying on the ground. We followed the sound of giggles to the back of the barn, where we encountered the strangest sight, a small creature, about 4 feet tall, that looked like a monkey but had eerie red eyes. The creature seemed scared and was making odd gestures with its arms. We were frozen in place, too shocked to move or speak. We could hear more of these creatures running away into the woods, leaving this one behind. It didn't attack us, and Mike was too stunned to even point the rifle at it. The creature continued making defensive gestures with its arms as it backed away. Then, in a flash, it turned and sprinted into the woods, disappearing after the others. Unfortunately, we discovered that these creatures had killed around 3 cows, including the one in the living room. Soon after, Mike's uncle arrived, and we recounted the bizarre events. We expected him to think we were crazy, but his reaction was one of anger and frustration, as if he had dealt with this before. We asked if he knew what these creatures were, expressing our fear and confusion. He sternly told us that if this ever happened again, we should call him immediately and never attempt to confront the creatures without him. His response left us with more questions than answers, but it was clear that this wasn't his first encounter with the mysterious beings. That night left a lasting impression on us, blending the excitement of our adventure with a chilling mystery we couldn't fully understand.
It was 1968, and I was just 8 years old. My 2 big brothers and I had a cherished ritual of fishing at the river, a 20-minute walk from our house. Fishing was more than a pastime, it was a lifeline. We were poor, and not every night did we have food on our table. Bringing home fish to see our mother's face light up with joy was the biggest reward for us. One particular day, circumstances forced us to fish at night. My brothers often worked with my uncle during the day, so I had to wait for them. That evening, they arrived home around 8 p.m., and we set off on our fishing adventure under the cloak of darkness. When we reached the river, we built a fire to ward off the chill in the air. With everything prepared, we began fishing, eager for a good catch. About 10 minutes into our endeavor, strange things began to unfold. The water started moving in a peculiar manner, unlike anything we'd seen before. We initially thought it was some animal stirring below the surface. Then, a strong wind erupted out of nowhere, thrashing the trees violently. Leaves swirled around us and dust clouded our faces. The wind destroyed our fire, scattering the burning wood across the site. But the strangest part was what we saw next. As we looked at the river, a foggy figure emerged, appearing to float above the water. It looked like a man and a woman, locked in an embrace, as if they were sailing through the mist. Though I couldn't see their faces clearly, it felt as though they were hugging each other in fear. We were frozen in terror, our fishing rods forgotten at our feet. Then, panic took over, and we fled, running home without exchanging a single word. When we burst through the door, our mother rushed to us, her face etched with concern. We recounted our eerie encounter, our words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She tried to calm us, assuring us it was over, and tucked us into bed with soothing words. The next morning, curiosity drove us back to the river to retrieve our fishing rods and assess the damage the wind had caused. To our shock, everything was intact. The site was serene and undisturbed, as if the previous night had never happened. The trees stood tall and unscathed. Our fire pit was exactly where we had built it, and our fishing rods lay undisturbed. It was as though the entire experience had been a collective hallucination. To this day, my brothers and I can't explain what happened that night. The memory of those ghostly figures and the sudden, inexplicable chaos haunts us. After that, we only ever went fishing during the day, unwilling to tempt whatever dark forces might lurk by the river after sundown.
I used to work in a small office where everyone knew each other pretty well, or at least I thought we did. There was one guy, Tom, who always seemed a bit off. He was quiet, kept to himself, and had this distant look in his eyes, like he was always deep in thought about something no one else could understand. But I never thought much of it. One afternoon, we had a meeting scheduled in one of the smaller conference rooms. It was just going to be me and Tom, going over some project details. We both walked in, and I heard the click of the lock. That was strange. I turned to ask him why he locked the door, but before I could say anything, I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. There was a wildness there, a kind of frenzied energy that I hadn't seen before. His usual quiet demeanor was replaced by an intense focus on me, like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. I asked what was going on. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he started pacing the room, mumbling to himself. I could barely make out what he was saying, but it was something about them and how they were watching him, how he couldn't trust anyone anymore. His voice was growing louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sinking feeling that something was very, very wrong. I suggested we talk outside, trying to stay calm and not provoke him, but he wasn't listening. He was caught up in whatever was happening in his mind, and it was like I wasn't even there anymore. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped pacing and turned to face me. His eyes were wide, his breathing heavy. He said that they told him I was one of them and that I had been stalking him. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I asked him who they were and assured him I wasn't stalking him, trying to break through whatever delusion he was trapped in. But he wasn't hearing me. His grip tightened on the back of one of the chairs, knuckles white, and I realized I needed to get out of that room fast. I slowly moved toward the door, trying not to alarm him. But he noticed, and in an instant, he was between me and the door, blocking my way. He told me he wouldn't let me leave. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know how long I could keep him talking, how long before he did something unpredictable, something violent. I tried to reason with him, to convince him that we could figure this out together, but every word seemed to push him further into whatever nightmare he was living in. Just when I thought there was no way out, there was a loud knock on the door. Tom flinched, his attention momentarily distracted. It was enough. I took the chance, pushing past him with all my strength, fumbling with the lock, and throwing the door open. I nearly ran into one of our co-workers who had come looking for us, concerned about how long the meeting was taking. I didn't say anything, just hurried out of the room, my heart still racing. Tom didn't follow. He just stood there staring at the floor, lost in his own world. The next day, Tom was taken to a hospital for treatment, though no one ever told us exactly what was wrong. That was one of the creepiest situations I've ever experienced. One evening, my parents had to go to my grandma's house for the night to help with something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I knew I didn't want to go. After begging and pleading, my parents agreed to let me stay home, as long as I invited my friend Henry for a sleepover, so I wouldn't be alone. Henry came over and we spent the night playing video games, eating snacks, and watching TV. We were having a blast. As we were watching a movie, Henry fell asleep on the couch. It was getting late, so I decided to take a shower and get ready for bed. Back then, my father had installed an alarm system in the backyard. If anyone stepped into the yard, a light would turn on and a bell would ring inside the house. He did this because, a few years back, there were reports of someone sneaking into our neighbors' yards to steal bikes. Though it hadn't happened in over 2 years, the alarm system remained in place. It was around 1 a.m. when I had just started my shower. Suddenly, I heard the bell ring. At first, I thought Henry might have gone outside, but it was strange since he was already asleep, and he was such a shy guy. He would have told me if he was going out. Something felt off. I quickly wrapped a towel around myself and went to peek through the kitchen window. The backyard light was on, but the door was locked, and Henry was still asleep on the couch. Someone or something must have been there. I didn't have the courage to go outside, so I just stood there, peeking through the window. Everything seemed normal, so I went back to finish my shower. Just 2 minutes later, the bell rang again. Someone had to be out there. I left the shower once more and ran to the kitchen. As I turned on the light, I bumped into Henry, who was standing there with a terrified expression. He told me he heard a strange bump on the door and came to see if it was me. But when he entered the kitchen, he saw the shadow of a person right outside the window. My heart pounded with fear. We had no idea where this person had gone. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but before I could finish dialing, the kitchen window shattered. Glass flew everywhere, and Henry screamed and ran. We didn't wait another second. We bolted to the front yard, hoping the intruder wouldn't follow. Once we got to the street, we saw a car passing by. The man inside heard our screams and saw how scared we were. He stopped his car and tried to calm us down, calling the police himself. We hid behind his car, trembling, while we waited for the police. Minutes later, the police arrived and entered the house to search for the intruder. They found no one. The kitchen window was shattered, but nothing was stolen. Maybe our screams had scared the person away. I called my parents and they rushed home, spending the rest of the night with us, shaken by what could have happened if the intruder had found us in our rooms. To this day, we don't know who it was, and the memory of that night still haunts me.